The Quarantine Sessions podcast with J. Cole.
How's it going?
Yeah, very well. Where are you this time?
I'm in Bali, where I've been the whole time.
Still in Bali.
Although my background makes it appear otherwise, perhaps I have descended into some kind of alternate universe. And you're in England?
Yes, right in the middle of England, in the countryside, Staffordshire.
Excellent.
Do you have a picture of myself? Can you see me? Or
no, the camera appears to be off. Oh, there you are. Excellent.
Yeah. Right. Good.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time, and I so appreciate you meeting me here. I'm sorry we had to rearrange this, but I think it will be for the benefit of both of us to do this conversation at a slightly later time.
Okay, that's fine.
So,
what are you doing in Bali?
Well, I'm an artist, and it's a beautiful place to live. And I came here for the first time 4 years ago and just fell in love with it. And it's very inexpensive to live here, and the quality of life is very high. And so I'm just living and relaxing and making art and doing podcasts and things like that. It's a great place to be kind of unhindered, you know? So it gives me a lot of freedom to be able to just do as I please.
Not as many Australians as there would be normally, I would think.
Yeah, strangely enough, the Russian population is, I think, the highest population here.
Good Lord.
There's more Russians than just about anybody else. And very few Americans, in fact, which I don't mind too much, but
right.
Yeah.
What sort of Russians are we talking about here? I mean,
Russian hippies.
Russian hippies, all right. Okay.
Russian hippies, yeah. It's a different kind of Russians. You know, they're still Russians. They still have that kind of like hard-edged Russian style, but they're hippies, you know. They're into tarot cards and drink ayahuasca and things like that.
Bloody hell. I thought Bali was a sort of fundamentalist Muslim hotspot these days, or is that decline?
I think that there are parts of the island that still cater to that. However, the Balinese have a very strong tradition of Hinduism that's also a mixture of Hinduism and their own kind of animistic shamanism. So they're very devout with their religious beliefs. It's one of the things I think that attracts people most to coming here, because it's a very magical place. Have you been here before?
No, never been to Bali. No. It always seemed to me to be too touristic.
Well, yeah, there is that, but then you can also kind of go into what I like to call deep Bali, which is where you can kind of just go off into it and like experience the real culture.
Right.
But something that I love about you is that you've really been exploring the spirituality of your own roots, you know, and British history has a lot of spiritual significance, and you've written a lot about that.
For sure. I don't know. It's not on the, like you need your deep Bali. There's a deep England.
Yeah.
And you have to look for it. It's like all these things. It's not automatically apparent at all, and it has no political aspect to it. So there's always been a kind of spiritual underground of one sort or another in England. I think it used to be much more part of the culture than it is now, and probably was the root of a lot of the culture. Right from the Middle Ages, from Chaucer onwards, it's been there. But there was a kind of a recrudescence of it in the 60s, everybody knows about. And you have that reflected in the Glastonbury Festival, of Michael Eavis. And So it probably coming through now, people probably access to this sort of spirituality is coming through music, I think, primarily. Less so art, because there is, British art is very academic. And while there is a certain openness to spiritual themes, it's really rather muted. They do follow, the tendency in the British art schools is to follow the established history of art, and history of art sort of parallels the history itself, like we're supposedly in a quote postmodern situation. So there's sort of, at the moment, there's a kind of anarchy, but there is a I mean, I know Anthony Gormley. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Anthony Gormley is a sculptor in England, very famous. He did The Angel of the North, which is a huge, he does a lot of public sculptures. I know that he went through a period of sort of spiritual reflection in his own life. But I'd say it's muted. It's muted in the visual arts and more present in pop music. In classical music, it's hard to pinpoint there. I listen to Radio 3, which is the BBC's classical program, and they still call Debussy an impressionist, which means they haven't absorbed the learning and scholarship that's been dedicated, including mine, to making it clear that Debussy's inspiration was of a hermetic and spiritual kind. So yeah, I think it's fundamentally it's a materialist civilization we're in. There's very little reflection of anything else on television. The general obsessions, you know, sex and acquisition and social issues dominate English culture to a degree which, you know, you just get sick to death of it.
It seems that from cultures like that, that's why there are spiritual undergrounds that emerge. And if I think about historically, a lot of the main sort of movements within spirituality in the West did come out of England. People like John Dee or Aleister Crowley, or even the Beatles, which had a huge influence on spirituality in the West. A lot of psychedelic culture seems to have emerged out of England. And then later on in the 1970s with chaos magic and things like that as well. Yes, it seems that
but this was always a small group, if you like, group. There was an alarm. There was an alarm in the media in the late 60s and early 70s that these dangerous people, these hippies, were, you know, in danger of taking over. And there was a long reactionary period. I mean, I left university in the beginning of the 1980s and had to go to London to make a living and all the rest of it. And then the whole culture turned, you know, Madonna, material girl, you know, and I was trying to make spiritually minded television very much against the grain. The whole thing was, people were embarrassed about the 60s. There was a lot of embarrassment about the enthusiasms of the 60s, particularly spiritual ones. And eventually the media, newspapers, got the term New Age. And New Age became a kind of dirty word for anything that tinged of tarot cards, crystals, magic, etc. And we don't celebrate our spiritual culture in this country. And I think the fact that it communicates abroad through my own work and other people's work is fantastic, I think. But I consider my personal market for what I do is mostly now America. I feel I'm living in an island just off the coast of Maine, which I think is a way a lot of people in America probably think England is a little island off the coast of Maine. But I definitely gravitate to the idea that Britain always kills its children, like Kronos. Look how we treated the Beatles, John Lennon particularly. It's like there's a certain amount of tolerance, and then the establishment comes on your head. So the spiritual culture of England is vivid, it's real, but it's also muted And in a sense, I would say it was in a way, it suffers. It's vulnerable, shall we say. And it's not reflected in the mainstream media hardly at all, except in a sentimental way sometimes. But, you know, you've always got a newspaper. Everything magical is always satanic, you know, which people don't take really very seriously, but it's thought of as a distasteful thing. I mean, I've been fascinated by this whole COVID thing to see the established church's reaction to the closure of churches. Now, churches have never been closed in British history since the time of King John, which is sort of about 1215, 800 years ago. No one's closed a church for any reason, you know, and certainly not so easily or so widespread. They started closing them as a, you know, people might catch a disease. In other words, there is absolutely no consideration to the idea that religion or spirituality might have something to say about this situation, or might have any kind of cure for it. It's seen as just a personal thing. You go to church, you don't go to church, that's your business. But there's no conception that reality and spirituality are together. Spirituality is something you indulge in England. I'd say strangely, America, even though the quality of the religion that's practiced in America may vary enormously in different places, I'd say that America still is fundamentally a religious culture, or it is a collection of religious cultures.
It does seem that the yearning for spirituality is more pronounced within America, and it does seem that a lot of spiritual figures, including both William Blake and Aleister Crowley, were quite denigrated by the British public in their lifetimes, and you've written about both people very extensively. So it does seem that British culture is a bit allergic to spiritual ideas, and it's always been very marginalized and pushed underground. But yet these people that have emerged out of British culture have also had a tremendous influence on the spirituality of the Western world as a whole.
Well, I think it was John Lennon said, if we can make it in Britain, we can make it anywhere. If you can break the barriers in England, you'll never get kind of psychological opposition like you will in England. So in that sense, America was a pushover. When the Beatles arrived in '64, America sort of rolled over on its back like a little dog, said, "Yes, we love you," you know. And the Beatles charmed their way across America quite quickly in a rather wonderful way. And you know that phrase from the Bible, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country. I think Britain, the Isles of Britain, generate prophets every so often. Very powerful spiritual voices. And they have to be tough because you've got to get through somehow living in a country that really wants to silence its prophets. If you can imagine Jesus coming into Jerusalem in the 1st century and the Sadducees and the Herodian party in the temple, what they didn't want was religious enthusiasts spoiling it. You know, they got a nice deal going with the Romans. Religion was under control. So long as you could keep religion under control, that in one sense is what government is about. And of course, today it's much more complicated because anyone can see that there are countries where a certain kind of religion is out of control, and we see the terrible results of that. The point is, what's the quality of the religion? I would say the spiritual streams that have interested me, which you can say are broadly Gnostic, have always been positive, and I can't think of groups of Gnostics going around smashing people's statues or windows or trying to destroy things, because the Gnostic attitude is either one of indifference to the material world anyway, and putting all one's hopes in a spiritual vision. And there is also the fundamental spirit of Gnosis is pacific. You know, it's the violence of the world is something that makes people Gnostics. You know, it's the conditions of real life that turn people towards faith in the spiritual dimensions of life, or Blake would say the infinite worlds within. And if you're going to engage with your culture, as I have tried to do, you do have to, as Paul put it, put on the whole armor of God, because it's not like the world is begging for this sort of thing. But I do find in America there is well, America, you can find anything there, good or bad. And the good is very, very good. And the bad is very, very bad. And you can shop for salvation, or you can shop for an AK-47. You know, you can probably get, I'm not sure if you can get salvation on a credit card, but they're probably working on it somewhere. You can send for, yes, I mean, it'll be interesting what you can't get from Amazon in the future, isn't it? What won't you get? Will it be what you need most, maybe?
Yeah. Well, I'm generally speaking affiliated with mostly spiritual communities, and I find that the spiritual communities that I associate with, Eastern spirituality is very popular, so Buddhism, yoga, things like this. But you've specialized mostly in the Western esoteric tradition, which I personally find very fascinating. And it surprises me that so many people within kind of modern spiritual New Age culture don't really know a lot about it, and it's not part of their diet at all. And I was curious if you could speak a little bit on the history of spirituality as it pertains to the West in general. I know that's a very broad question.
It's sounding great.
But how specifically how people like Aleister Crowley or H.P. Blavatsky played a role in the emergence of spirituality as it's known now, and as it might be interacted with in a kind of dare I say New Age way, but you know, the synthesis of all these different world religions, which I know.
I'll make a few stabs in that direction.
All right, let's do it.
If you just see what comes forth. I think it's important to recognize that on the continent of Europe, from the mid to late 19th century, there grew up, or was rekindled, an excitement, a spiritual excitement that we were in preparation for an age of the Holy Spirit. Now, this had been promised since, well, obviously since New Testament times, but it had been particularly common an idea in the 13th century. And it re-emerges in various apocalyptic forms. In the 19th century, you get this explosion of materialism, by which I mean the philosophy of a mechanical universe, that man's ability to manipulate machines and technology proved that the essential interest of man was matter, and that ultimately everything would have a material explanation in what we call science. And so man's ingenuity, his brilliance at making Bessemer converters and steel and huge mechanical constructions, eventually the motor car, the locomotive, all these seem to suggest that the world was a machine, and it could be understood rationally with mathematics and the development of physics and this. Now, you get a reaction to this. Blake starts it off. Blake is reacting to it almost when the Industrial Revolution begins in the middle of the 18th century. He envisioned that man could well get caught, the spirit of man would somehow get caught up in these cogs and these wheels, and he would become the whole universe. This is what he means by the dark satanic mills. It means that the universe is just a mechanical system of vortices and wheels, great wheels, where, you know, the planets. Newton had seemed to present a universe that was really a kind of elaborate machine. God had set this machine in motion, and that was it, and we're in it. And there was a reaction to this. There was a spiritual reaction in sensitive people. They began to see that this great machine was also, rather like in the Charlie Chaplin movie Modern Times, was a kind of hell, because man really becomes superfluous. What's our role except to make more machines? And you get a disquiet that man serves the machine, not the machine serves man. Some people felt they were in this process, people were losing something. Of course, enormous fortunes were being made. and across the United States, the building of the Transcontinental Railway, the opening up of California, the opening up of the Klondike, all depended on vast amounts of money being made out of this system. And again, spiritually sensitive people began to wonder about what kind of new world was going to come from this. And it began to look anything but paradisal. If you look at the dreams of American visionaries in the late 18th century, they were generally pastoral and romantic. They were celebrating big canvases, beautiful views, God's imminent creation. His spirit is in the waters, his spirit is in the trees. America is a beautiful thing. And this vision of a romantic world is being darkened gradually. You see it reflected in paintings, the famous painting by Seurat of the bathers at Asnières, you know, the famous pointilliste painting.
Yeah.
People would say it's a bit psychedelic now because he does the whole thing in little dots of paint. And this came out in about 1884. And if you look at the background of these workers bathing in the Seine, in the distance you see smokestacks of the new industry, which is being constructed at Asnières, and if you got closer to that, you'd see it was full of soot and steam and steam. Artists start to rebel. You get the decadent movement in Paris, and the decadents are terribly important because they recognize they saw their civilization as not a progressive one, but in a state of decay. That in fact spiritually it was on its last legs, and the decadents opened their minds, and this where you come in. They started to open their minds up to the infinite within. And so they experimented with drugs, and people like Rimbaud did, Baudelaire, were interested in how do you get through this matter. Meanwhile, they were sensitive to, there were a few strange men like Eliphas Levi, who was a French priest, who pushed this idea that a new age of Holy Spirit was coming. And in this age of Holy Spirit, it would be the spiritual capacities of man that would become predominant, and there would be a retreat of materialism, i.e. the philosophy that everything is basically solid stuff. In other words, spirit has been, as it were, sucked out of the universe. It's a spiritless place. It's basically a machine. The brain is a machine, the age of reason, you know, as we call it. And so this openness starts to develop. Now, in England, we had already had the Romantic movement, which is very much an English creation, I think. Most people would agree that you've got Wordsworth, you have Coleridge, you have the pre-Raphaelites, the reflections in Blake. You're getting it mostly in the visual arts and in poetry. And I think this is where the new spirituality is coming from. It's people who basically see themselves as creative artists, and they're looking for deeper levels of creation. So I think Aleister Crowley comes out of the decadent movement. He had decadent, of course, then didn't mean what it means to people now. It didn't mean something that was corrupt. It's people who are reflecting on the corrupt character of the civilization, people who witnessed the decay and felt that it was tumbling into an end. In France, there was a great belief amongst sensitive artists that Germany, for example, which was a new industrial civilization, was going to invade France and destroy it with huge machines and mechanized warfare, which of course did happen in 1914. But somehow out of this, this conflagration would come a spiritual parousia, a hierophany, a manifestation of the sacred. So older religious ideas become important to artists and original thinkers. And you have books by Edvard Chouret, talks about the great initiates, and he includes this rather old-fashioned, depending on your knowledge of history, but anyway, it's that you have Moses, you have Orpheus, he has a figure called Rama, who seems to be a combination of Abraham and the origin of Hinduism. And he sees that there was an ancient knowledge that predated the flood that is coming back through what the theosophists call the tradition. And this idea of the tradition becomes very important in theosophy. Madame Blavatsky founds with Colonel Olcott the Theosophy Society, Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, the year that Eliphas Levi dies, the year that Aleister Crowley is born. So 1875 becomes a kind of cornerstone, a new era begins. And in that process, as you all know, that people started to look into Hinduism and Buddhism very seriously. Blavatsky became virtually a Buddhist. She signed up for the Buddhist initiation with Colonel Olcott in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as they call it now, in the 1870s and 1880s. She then went to India and encouraged the Indians they met to withstand Christianity, to hold out against it and be confident in their own shastras, their own prophetic writings. Now, Blavatsky's followers in Europe began to be dismayed about this stress on Hinduism and Buddhism, and especially in England and France. People began to say, but hang on a minute, we're not going to become Hindus. We don't think that way. That's not our experience of the universe. We have a different approach. And we also have, they start to say, our own spiritual traditions, Hermeticism, aspects of what you could call broadly white magic, Gnostic traditions, the Moravian Brethren, Swedenborgianism, all kinds of movements that came out of the Reformation, which stressed the inner light and the mystical experience of man. And I said, we have all that. And while we can see there are connections with the beliefs of the Vedantists and Advaita, the idea of God within, that there's a communion of the greater deity with the individual soul. While that is helpful, we can't just sell out and go Indian. And this idea of the Western tradition starts to become strong, especially in Paris, under the leadership of men like Papus, Gérard Encausse, and his friends de Guetta and also Joséphin Pelledin. I think the British movement, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Crowley, owes a very great deal to the French occult revival, as it's called, of the 1880s and 1890s. And then, of course, Crowley does something very different with it. And basically because he had a reaction against, as some people reacted against Buddhism because of Buddhism's incompatibility with certain Christian understanding of man's place in the universe. Crowley had a difficulty with Christianity in general because he'd been raised by exclusive Protestant, we'd say a bigoted religious system, unless of course you're part of it, in which case it's the only way. But he reacted against that, and he decided that Christianity in general had been a bad thing. And he follows Gibbon's view that what has become Christianity is so different to whoever founded it may have been thinking, that it may as well be dumped wholesale. He said he said Judaism is a fiendish and Christianity a savage superstition. And what he meant was, he's referring directly to Leviticus, where it says, there is no salvation without the shedding of blood. There is no redemption without blood being shed. And he said, in conformity with his friends at Cambridge, where he studied, he said he saw all this blood stuff, sacrifice, as primitive, as part of a primitive stage in human development, due to man's vulnerability to nature. We have to make offerings to the gods so that the whole thing carries on, because how do we know the sun won't rise tomorrow unless we have a sacrifice? So you have to make an offering to this god, you make an offering to that god, and if the harvest is bad, then you might have to kill some of your best bullocks. And if it's really bad, perhaps we sacrifice the firstborn. You've got the story in Genesis of Abraham being asked by God to kill his own son as a sacrifice. Okay, at the last minute, Abraham, he said, it's okay, you would do it, but I don't really want you to do it. But Crowley looks at this from a modern perspective, a sensibility, and he says, this is ridiculous. He says Abraham should have just killed his son. Looks at there, now I've done it, now what do you do? He challenges that whole tradition of what some people call the forensic atonement, i.e. Christ has to die the bleeding lamb on the cross so that we may be saved. That way God will somehow acquit us of our sins, and in the final judgment, those who have faith in that act will be saved. Crowley says,
it's generally accepted that Crowley was quite traumatized by his Christian upbringing, right?
He wasn't. I mean, he had a terrible time at one particular school, which had to be closed down after his uncle alerted the authorities, because he was physically victimized and nearly died under the kind of tortures that they were doing, all in the name of Jesus, you know. And he saw the hypocrisy he saw the profound hypocrisy of a lot of Christianity. But I think his basic objection to Christianity, I think, apart from the moral objection about its theory of sacrifice, which you see reflected in people's attitude to war. I mean, Earl Haig, who led many men to their deaths in the First World War, said it's okay because they're all going to heaven, you know. I mean, that's an extraordinary justification for firing bullets at your German Christian brothers. Well, they're all going to heaven. Well, why don't they all kill themselves instead? You get there quicker. You know, it's really, I mean, it's a crazy way of thinking. Every war is a sacrifice. We celebrate the sacrifice. And Crowley says this attitude to blood sacrifice is primitive. The only sacrifice, and he began to look at how all this attitude was reflected, especially in sex and sexual consciousness. And I think his greatest objection to Christianity was that it regarded the sexual nature of man as fundamentally sinful and something to be avoided. Whereas he'd had experience in India, because he was very profoundly read in Hindu and very much Buddhist philosophy, and became a Buddhist. He was, 1903, he describes himself as a Buddhist. He began to see that you know, the sexual nature of man is actually related to his most fundamental spiritual characteristic. And this is what separates Crowley from a lot of the other occultists, magicians, spiritual teachers, etc. of the time, is that he goes all the way where sex is concerned, and he develops a kind of sexual religion. And whenever you get sex and religion together, you always get massive opposition. People find it some people find it particularly shocking. He's accused of confusing the planes and so on. And you know, because since the Roman Empire period, all of the monotheist religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, have all put women down, and the sexual urge has been regarded as something that has to be suppressed. If you can't suppress it, you'll never be holy. Whereas Crowley is reviving, in his own mind, he's reviving a tradition where sex becomes a form of worship. And this marks him out very differently. I think, back to your other point about Britain, I think what we produce in Britain are pioneers and a great deal of originality. Why this should happen in this country so often and in so many fields of inventiveness, I don't know. You know, you don't get this practically anywhere. It's hard to say. Is it because of the Reformation and that we were the first to break with Rome and the Inquisition and break the power of the Inquisition? Is it because we were the first to cut off a king's head and say, well, we're not going to be dictated to by a single person just because they happen to be a king? Is that, you know, but again, you can see all those as pioneering as well. There just seems to be something about the British Isles which generates a certain pioneering personality. And the urge to go around the world and take that further is part of that. And I am not among those people who think that, you know, the British Empire was all evil or something. And I think there were good things that happened through its operation, and bad things too. But it wasn't all bad. And a lot of good things were spread around the world, I think. And you know, and that's really another story. But I mean, Theosophy, for example, the encouragement of the Indian on the one hand, we were sending missionaries out to India to bring Christianity, not forcefully in India, by the way, but Christianity was brought before the Indians as something to consider. But we also had people out there who were saying quite the opposite and were bringing Hinduism and Buddhism back to Britain and, of course, to America as well. So there's been a very fecund and fruitful passage of ideas between East and West, and I think that's a positive thing, even though it's led to some confusion. But you're bound to be confused when you find what you thought was the whole world is opened up, and you have to embrace, or at least recognize, that not everyone thinks the way you do, and that doesn't make them bad; it makes them different, you know, and so on. So, I mean, I think it is. If there is going to be a return to, or a revival of spiritual psychology and thinking and attitudes, and especially values, in this age, it seems to me anyway that we're on a kind of turning point. I mean, we're either witnessing the long death throes of materialism and perhaps a new civilization coming out of it, or I suspect we are absolutely buggered, and we, you know, I don't know how much more materialism we can stand, really. If you see things like tactical weaponry being arrayed from, you know, around the world, aimed at people as an aspect of science gone wrong, you know, into ballistic missiles and all this sort of thing. I mean, who sent the first ballistic missile? Who was the first to develop this? This was the Nazis, wasn't it? I mean, we just copied them. You know, we say we've defeated Nazism, but we've inherited their most offensive weapons and developed them further. So, you know, these are factors. What sort of future do we want? These are the questions. The spiritual. Crowley said something very interesting once. He said, the yogi gets more pleasure from moving his leg than a millionaire does after a week in New York. And that's the difference between spiritual values and material values. With material values, you have to pour more and more and more into a thing to get more and more pleasure out. Whereas in the spiritual thing, you need less and less and less and less and get a fundamentally richer experience. As Blake says, the fool sees not the same tree a wise man sees. It's how you view the world. So what we're talking about is envisioning the world differently. Instead of seeing it as a pool of resources that have to be used, dug up, transformed and spat out as carbon, you start to see the world, you start to see that there's an interplay you can have with all the natural forces in the world, and their beauty and form can be celebrated. But man is a hungry animal, and when it comes down to it, you know, his hunger will always come first when he's hungry. And when he's hungry, because he's not very considerate about what he eats or how he eats it. You know, there is this animal aspect of man, and this is another thing that the spiritual teachings address. It's no good us pretending we're angels on earth. We may be angels at some developmental aspect of our being, but in reality, we're hungry creatures who rely on our parents, first of all, to feed us. Our first experience of the world is being fed. So we kind of expect to be fed as any animal does. We have, though, human beings have within them this other capacity. It's not just a thinking capacity, it's a capacity to envision ourselves beyond the material. I mean, I thought that was the whole point about psychedelicism. You wanted to talk about that. It means soul expanding. So if it's expanding your soul, then it's psychedelic. It doesn't have to be, what do they call them now, entheogenic stimulants. You can expand your soul through contemplation or through, well, exercise, through mountain climbing, through many, many things, painting, what have you. It's all when it's the key moment is when you forget yourself. You create the best art. I would think the best art is when you're not about yourself. You are totally involved with the work. At the moment that the ego goes, the greatest work is done. I often feel with my best work, I don't remember writing that. because I wasn't conscious of myself when I was doing it. I don't mean I was a medium, just, it's coming through, I'm channeling. I'm not channeling, I'm thinking, but the self is not involved. The ego isn't there. The gyroscope's just spinning nicely. And when the gyroscope...
The flow state.
Pardon?
The flow state.
Yeah, if you like, the flow state. Mm-hmm. That's a new one to me, but fair enough. So I prefer...
Flow is kind of a hot word now, I think.
I like spin. I think I like the idea of spinning, because flowing, you might be going with somebody else's flow, whereas if you're spinning, it's still you're centered. That I prefer the spin anyway. But of course, spin now has a different meaning as well, doesn't it? So.
Yeah, sure. It seems to me that Aleister Crowley had a lot of similar ideas to the values that emerged out of the psychedelic revolution in the 1960s.
Oh, he was a psychedelic pioneer. He was one of the first people, I think, before him. The only person I can think of before him who was experimenting seriously with mescaline was Havelock Ellis, who was just around the same time. So he was definitely sadly, most of his writings on psychedelics were destroyed. He wrote volumes on the subject when he was at Cefalù in 1920, 1921. And all that work was, I believe, destroyed by British customs, or lost when he was forced out of Italy by Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator. But what he did write some texts on hashish also, on which are perfectly sound, which are scientific studies of the psychology of hashish, which were pioneering, definitely. Oh yeah, he was. He did say, I think at one point, nature needs something to help it over the obstacles. But then again, in 1924, he'd become physically addicted to heroin and psychologically addicted to cocaine. And he went through a terrible, terrible experience in Paris in 1924 when he was trying to kick his dependence on these. And in the end, he says, man simply doesn't need these things. He's talking about cocaine and heroin. It's that they're just emergency supplies, and that's how they should be regarded, because they impacted on his will. And the whole theory of Crowleyan metaphysics is based on that you act in accordance with what he calls the true will, which really means that the divine spark within you. That's the true will, not what you want, but what you are deep down. And coming to the realization of being a spiritual being is what Crowleyan initiation is supposedly all about, and is not original at all. It's the same idea you'll find in Western esotericism right through. I mean, it's what you could call it being a master mason, which just means being a man who's in charge of himself, who's got his being under a degree of discipline and control, and but at the same time becomes a fountain of new things, or what you call the genius, or which is that aspect of us which is on the other side of the material world which we're faced with through our senses. So it's extrasensory being. The genius in the old days, genius simply meant then the other word was the daimon, which is a kind of being which is also in some sense ourselves, or we are a kind of projection of that being into 3 dimensions. And it's being in touch with that side. That's where the great inspiration or inspiriting comes from. And so the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel is precisely that. It's to find your genius. Now, today, this idea of the genius is very confusing, because it seems to mean 2 things. One is it's somebody with a tremendous gift for mathematics or playing the piano, what used to be called a prodigy. Somebody who was prodigiously gifted with a skill, would say they're a genius at it. Okay. And the other meaning of genius would be, somebody who creates an original film, the like of which people think has never been seen before. They say, that's a genius. Or somebody says, he paints like, or she paints like no one ever painted before, they're a genius. These are just exaggerated terms for somebody who's gifted. But the genius in spiritual terms is the divine aspect of being, and the ultimate flame. And the aim of the Gnostic path is to be more of that than you thought you were capable of being. God is that being of us that we don't know, or are out of touch with. We've lost this divine image in being in the world. So there's always that aspect of, on any magical or spiritual path, and they are very similar if indeed they're distinct.
Well, that was something I wanted to ask you, actually, is do you see a diversion between magic and spirituality? Is there a difference?
Well, Crowley always said that that magic was a kind of shortcut and mysticism was the longer route. Mysticism is the slow conquest of the ego, shall we say, the slow identification with God. Whereas magic is much more about getting practical results quickly. So you're if you're going to follow the older forms of magic, you're making a wager with imaginary angels, beings who help you get what you want. But when you get down to it, you realize that no angel worth their salt can do anything that the greater power above it wants. So one might just as well go for God, He thought occultism, as he called it, was an easier way, with a slight feeling in that you discover the beauty of mysticism through trying to practice magic. There is that idea. I don't think he would want to divorce one from the other entirely. In any Renaissance magical text, they will always talk about there are different levels of magic. There's a terrestrial magic, there's a sublunary magic, and then there's religious magic. And in religious magic, you're talking about things like sacraments and transforming material things to be closer to God, to the source. So in that sense, I don't think you can totally separate them. Magic, though, is meant to be an operative attitude. It's an operating attitude. As a mystic, you might be not wanting to do anything. You might be like the Taoist, you're just going with you're looking for the Tao, you stick with it, as it were. There are passive forms, whereas magic is an active attitude. I mean, I would personally say that making art is a magical process. And I think
Undeniably.
And that was rediscovered in France in the late 19th century. And you've rediscovered it for yourself. And a lot of us do. It's when it comes down to it, magic is simply doing at your best, at your height. It's finding ways of getting the best through you.
I've also heard it described that magic is more in line with the Western mind because as a culture, we manipulate reality. That's what we do. We conquer, we manipulate, we are obsessed with the organization of reality, whereas Eastern systems attempt to completely bypass the material world and go straight for God or the dissolution of the ego, which is a bit out of the what we're programmed to see the world as. So it's a little bit more difficult for Western people to kind of conform to that worldview.
That is exactly what Rudolf Steiner and those who objected to Blavatsky's theosophy were saying in the 1890s. That is precisely the point. Steiner says that to the Indian, he said, life is really a kind of dream. And you might flow from one dream life into another dream life. But he said, the Westerner, everything to us, you can call it materialism, but the nature of people in the West, for any number of reasons, we could write books about, sees himself as an active participant, a co-creator with God, not as a passive being. There is a passivity in Oriental religion, Far Eastern particularly, Buddhism and Hinduism, a total acceptance of man's, we are not here to change anything. Whereas in the West, the attitude, and you could say this is in the Christian tradition, is to make a better or an easier or a more interesting experience for ourselves. We see the world as gods. We see it as something we can do something with. And the question then is simply, are we doing the right thing with it or the wrong thing with it? Are we improving or are we not? In the 60s, when I was growing up, everything was excused by the word progress. If they were knocking down some beautiful 19th century building and putting up some dreadful block of flats, they said, well, it's progress, isn't it? Nothing, you can't stop progress. Progress simply meant anything that changed. I'd like to think we've got to a point now we realize that progress is the right kind of change. And then the question is, on what basis do we want to change? Now, the artist has much to say about this, if the artist is still concerned with beauty. And I do wonder whether some artists are still concerned with beauty. You obviously are. But, you know, I would say if you wanted to change a thing and make it more beautiful, if you want to change a thing and make it more harmonious, and all of those issues come in. But yes, you're absolutely right. We are magicians in the West. That is really what the Western esoteric tradition is saying, is we are the changers. We are the bridge between earth and heaven. We've got one dirty foot in matter and we've got one bit of our soul that's in the heavenly realm, and we can bridge this. And it's very difficult. I can't put into that paradigm of Eastern Western mentalities exactly where, say, the philosophy of Islam fits in. It's quite a difficult one, because in the history of Islam, you've had periods when there was a very active desire to change things. But then you get these terrible reactions and banning of images and against free learning and free sciences, and it must all conform to the scripture and as interpreted by some leading mullahs and so on. It's very difficult. I think Islam is in a very ambiguous position in this, because the whole thing is based on God has the will, Allah wills, and we accept, and we're supposed to accept it and not contradict this will. And that's quite comforting for somebody perhaps who doesn't like to think too much, or is quite happy to go on doing what they're doing. And I say my prayers 3 times a day. You know, I give a little bit to the poor, unless I'm poor myself, and so on. And you know, it's quite a comforting thing. But it creates a static civilization, and that's what happened in the Middle East. It created a stasis. Now, since the 20th century, 19th century, there's been a great exposure of the Western mentalities in the East, and this has had tremendous effects. One is it's caused a reaction towards fundamentalism certainly in what is called now Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Middle East, not in all, but in a great deal of it. You've got this belief. This is all too challenging for our traditional beliefs, and we will take what we want from it, especially the weapons. We'll take the weapons. We'll take the supermarkets. We'll take the mass-produced clothes, but we're not going to take the belief system that goes with it. And so you have a sort of strange mixture there. In the Far East, now take China, which has taken so many Western ideas unbelievably. They've taken everything bad, I'd say, that they've taken they've got nationalism, they've got communism, and they've got pure capitalism. You know, all now under the governance of a totalitarian state. I mean, and it's good God, what the reaction, how that's going to pan out. Meanwhile, religion, of course, is deeply frowned on in China as being antiquated and unscientific and so on and so forth. You know, where are there going to be any Chinese magicians? Crowley had an amazing talk with the wife of the Chinese ambassador to Britain in 1946. She came round, Mrs. Wellington Koo came round to his house in Hastings when he was retired by then. And he said, all China needs to go forward is to re-embrace its traditional spiritual thought. And of course, he's talking about the I Ching and Lao Tse and Taoism. And he said, if they stick with that, they'll be right, because he had a tremendous respect for the spiritual nature of China.
I think I heard that he was very much obsessed with the I Ching towards the later stages of his life, right?
Yeah, he wouldn't do, he barely went through a day or a decision without consulting it. I mean, even at the outbreak of World War II in 1939, he asks the I Ching, will the Germans win the war? And he came back with I can't remember the Chinese word for it, but it translates as the weak beam. So he was convinced from then on the Germans were definitely going to lose. It was clear to him. He had great faith. He wouldn't let anyone touch his use those sticks to set up a reading, and he wouldn't let anyone touch them. They had to have his occulted nature and not be interfered with. He put a lot, and I have to say, having studied every day of his diary for the entire period, but new book I've done is called Aleister Crowley in England, and that'll be out either next year or the year after, early the year after, or the end of next year. His readings that he got from the I Ching were almost always correct. I mean, remarkably so.
My own interactions with the I Ching have been pretty fascinatingly synchronistic.
Yeah, I know.
It's very accurate.
It's very annoying. I will only ever use divinatory methods as a very last resort when I really can't work something out. I can't get to a decision. I wouldn't make a habit of it because either they're too damned accurate and you're not at a position to deal with the implications of the message. I think a lot of people use these things as a way of encouraging them, making them feel better. Like they read daily horoscopes. They just want to feel a bit better. Things that maybe it'll get better tomorrow, or but the fact of the matter is used properly, they reflect your weaknesses as well as your hopes and strengths. And the nature of man is he can't suffer too much in one day. So if we're being called on to do something that's really difficult, the tendency is to say, well, God, I think I'll look at that again tomorrow. And then you remember the advice you were given, whether it was an I Ching or a tarot reading or whatever, or tea leaves or whatever else you use as a medium to capture your thoughts at a particular. I mean, that's what these things are. It's a medium. The brilliance of things like the I Ching is that the system seems to cover every possible eventuality for everybody. And because there's a fundamental truth in it, practically any advice is relevant to any issue anyway. There's always a dimension of any question which does involve the way you are responding to the world, which is, if you read your I Ching messages, it's usually about you. Are you acting as a noble person? Are you acting as all that? It's really all about where you're at. Whereas what we generally want is advice to tell us where other people are at. But
yeah, absolutely. It always speaks to you, which is sometimes not what you actually want in a reading.
Absolutely.
But I love that about it, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think it takes a certain amount of courage to engage with that, because it's going to show up your faults. I mean, nobody likes being criticized, but when so yeah, Crowley, as you say, but he did, yeah. Crowley said something very interesting about the Chinaman, the Chinese person as he saw them when he first went there, which was in 1900. And so it was very different. We're talking pre-communism, etc. And there's still strong traditional, a lot of Buddhism in South China where he was and so on. And he said that the Chinese is utterly convinced of the futility of life. And therefore, to do anything for him is just practically pointless. So, because they've absorbed so much of the traditional philosophy that, that you live, you die, and whatever you do 2 generations later, if you build a wall, somebody will knock it down. If you do this, everything in the world is corrupt. So Buddhism puts its hope in a state beyond any kind of state we can conceive. You can't define nirvana except negatively as really non-existence, like anatta. This was Buddha's fundamental, for him, a discovery. There's no soul, there's no continuity. Now, the Western mind can't really deal with this idea that there's no continuity. we seem to have to believe that it is worth doing things, even though we can't see the end of them. And I do think it's no good trying to ignore that. And I do find the Western Buddhist a rather sad character in some ways, because he is, or she is, in some ways trying to jettison as part of a discipline something which is innate in the Western mentality, generally speaking. Not in everybody, of course. There are born Buddhists, you know, people who don't care about the life they lead. They're only interested in something, an interior something or other, and they're not bothered about, you know, how you spend the time. I mean, my elder brother used to be, well, I would say he was a fatalist. Everything that happened, he said, fate, nothing you can do about it. So he wouldn't do anything about it. Short of getting up and, you know, if he had to earn some money, he went and earn some money. You know what I mean? He lived like that. Now, but I think certainly in the artistic and creative world, we cannot live on the basis that it's pointless, futile. Many of our efforts are, of course, pointless and futile, and we can see that in our own lives. But we do have we've inherited this Judaic view that you call it Judeo-Christian, but a Judaic view really, that there is a point to it all. You know, that there is some ultimate value in the time process, and that things can change. And the whole thing we've been talking about, Western esotericism, is based on the idea that ultimately we will reach what it calls an age of Holy Spirit, or where we become spiritualized, where the human being has realized his ultimate potential as being a spiritual being who is able to operate freely in what is a material universe. And we could be moving a bit towards that. There are elements of it in science. Heisenberg was well up on this, the so-called quantum physicist. He saw something in the new quantum vision of subatomic reality that suggested, I think, to his mind, that if we are sufficiently pure in our being, we will start to see that this whole so-called material universe will meet at a certain point a level of spiritual consciousness where we will be able to manipulate it at a most fundamental level. So what appeared a barrier will cease to be a barrier, in the same way that if we could go into an electron microscope with our consciousness and look between the atoms, the nuclei, and all the subatomic particles people are inventing to explain certain phenomena that register. We don't really know what's going on the subatomic level. We're trying damn hard. But there is a link. There is a curious link between this level of being and the spiritual state of mind. They seem somehow made for each other. And I can see a point where spirituality and science start to come together again. I don't think it's going to be, you know, what it will take to do that is what it will take to do that. It could be any number of crises which force, if you think of the scientific developments of the 20th century, has been side by side with these terrible conflicts. Now, this was another of Crowley's unwelcome messages. He says the Aeon of Horus, the new age of Horus, the child, will be attended by cataclysmic conflict, which will bring out all the if you like a disease brings out all the filth and the dirt in the system onto the skin, and eventually you purge yourself with it. He saw the Aeon of Horus beginning in its massive purge, and he saw the Second World War as he thought it would be. He thought the Second World War would be the definitive moment for the establishment of the Aeon of Horus. We'd finally get over what he would call the Christian nightmare of the sacrificial worldview, where we send millions of people to their deaths and this sort of thing. He thought finally that the individualism, real individualism, not capitalist individualism, the what Jung calls the individuation of man, that he becomes his true self. He saw this as the Second World War is vital, and I believe, he said, no, and this is incredible. In 1943, he wrote a letter to Louis Grady McMurtry, his follower, who was fighting the battle, about to fight after, so it was 1944, just about to fight in the Battle of the Bulge, if you've ever seen the movie. McMurtry was out there with an explosives group trying to undermine the Germans. And he writes to McMurtry during the war, Crowley does, I think 1965 will be a very important year in the development of the child, meaning the new era or eon. 1965, that's the year, you know, the Pet Sounds, that's the year of the Birds, Tambourine Man, that's the year Dylan goes electric, that's the year the Beatles produced their greatest work of art, Rubber Soul, that's the year, you know, the hippie thing really ignites in. So in that sense, that's why I did my book on the spiritual meaning of the 60s. The 60s is the beginning of the fulfillment, I think, of the Aeon of Horus, the Aeon of the child. And the question now is, 50 years later, is was that stamped out? Has it gone? Or is it just going through a change? And in fact, being the most spiritually fecund movement in the long term, is that going to bear fruit when we've got rid of the current obsession with the only news that's important is commercial news?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I wanted to ask you, because Crowley clearly had a vision that we would come into this spiritual age, as did many people. Do you see that occurring?
I do and I don't. I'm in two minds. I see its possibility. I'm aware of the forces that are arrayed against it, which are in ourselves as well as in your typical enemies, you know, the media, its obsession with the small world it seems to occupy. I mean, it's very strange, the media, isn't it? On the one hand, it's made the world, the great world, small. It's put it in our TV sets or in our computers. It's made it appear small. But on the other hand, what goes with that microscopy is it magnifies things that are not significant, i.e. daily events are magnified into the most, you know, movie level. Endless analysis on a statement made by somebody at 10:10 in the morning in a certain place is beamed over the world as if it's of great, great significance. Now, I don't know how many prophets there are at work in the world, but I never hear any on the media. I hear politicians giving their latest opinion, which they were advised to do by somebody or other, and their reaction to this and their reaction to that. Well, wise men don't keep reacting. Wise men observe. And if you beg them of a conclusion, they will give you a considered conclusion at a particular time. But we are not reactionaries. The magician is not a reactionary. Politicians are reactionary, and the public are being turned into the reaction to the reactor. People are always reacting. They go on the streets and get angry. They are reacting because something they saw on a screen. They didn't see it in person. It's totally irrelevant to their own lives unless somebody has made it important. So we have this continual magnification of detail, while at the same time, the beautiful infinite universe becomes apparently smaller. I think it becomes smaller so they can so their small minds can get inside this universe. I think the universe is considerably more extraordinary than this superficial view that is dominating. We need artists to tell us that, but how often do they interview an artist about events that happen, which are supposedly the most important? You know, in the end, at the moment, all you've got is very small people with very large weapons. You know, and when you talk about the people who really make a difference in this world, we're talking about very large people with very small weapons, the pen, the brush, the camera, what have you. And these are the people we need to be attending to. But people are being forced to worship at the altar of a completely facile pseudo-reality. It's no good Trump talking about the media as if it's the enemy when he himself is an absolute product of that media. He can't function without it. Where would he be without his Twitters and the National Enquirer and all the other mediums that have projected his objectionable image around the world of self-acquisition, self-aggrandizement and so forth? I mean, he's completely media. Take the media away from him, and you know, what have you got? You know, there's nothing there. You know, just another jock, bully, as far as I can see. That's my personal view. I dare say other people would say, but he's part of an important change, and you're underestimating the corruption of the White House. Well, I would never underestimate that. or the corruption of any political system that is power obsessed and is full of a lot of people trying to jockey for position so they get a nice big pension and retire in comfort. Which seems to be the object of politics, is simply to make ambitious people retire comfortably.
I'm optimistic because I believe that there are more artists now exploring these types of ideas than there ever have been before. But for the most part, those art movements are primarily underground, and they're not acknowledged, as you said, by the kind of mainstream media outlets. But I'm optimistic that that could change, and that as more people that are already in positions of being projected out through those media outlets become interested in spiritual ideas, that it can also affect the rest of the world. You know, I think we're somewhat in the midst of a second psychedelic revolution, and that
I'm delighted to hear that. Really delighted. I'm delighted to hear you say that. I mean, not only am I also a victim of the media, the very fact that I just wasted my words talking about the president of the current president of the United States, it shows how much of a media victim I am, because if I didn't watch TV, I wouldn't know this stuff. If I was concentrated on my art, which I should be, it would be peripheral. So forgive me for that. And I'm very interested in what you say. And perhaps living in a village in the countryside, as I do, I'm rather cut off from the kind of world that you clearly are celebrating. But it gives me enormous delight to think that this is still going on. I had an inkling in the 1990s. I had quite a lot of friends. Many of them were much younger than me, but they were very, very enthusiastic about a kind of new age and a revival of spiritual art and a world that was waking up to it. And then it all went again. It sort of all disappears. You remember the rave thing in the 90s?
Sure, yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think that what exists now is sort of an evolution out of that, with things like Burning Man and a lot of other kind of underground movements, and just the greater mainstream acceptance of psychedelics as they gain more scientific respect as having efficacy in treating post-traumatic stress disorder and other psychological ailments, and as the legality is shifting so that they can be used as medicines and in treating people in psychiatry and things like that, that people are starting to have more awakenings to these types of things. At least within my generation, I think it's becoming more and more popular. So I at least hold faith. I know that the current state of events looks quite dark, but I do hold faith that that can change, you know, and that these undergrounds, I mean, it's like a mushroom community, you know, there's the mycelial underground, and then there's the fruiting bodies which pop up. And that's kind of what I think is happening right now. And sometimes these underground movements seem to actually have greater strength than even what exists above the surface.
I think this is true. And I built my faith on it, indeed. And I have to say that I should come to California. Clearly,
you'd like
clearly
it.
I need more. I need a good shot of what you're talking about. I've held it in my heart, this belief, but I haven't seen much evidence of it in modern England at the moment. But not to say it isn't there at all, because I do occasionally, you know, one hears. But I think this movement in England is suffering somewhat. But then again, my daughter, she is positive about it. So I'm wondering whether I'm in the right country at the moment. It probably doesn't matter now. The fact that we can talk in this way is very important. I can't fly to America at the moment because of the COVID restrictions, but I intend to come again, and I'm really looking forward to that, because I think there is great work to be done, and I think America will be the New Jerusalem, personally.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, I do, and I the only problem with the psychedelic thing you're describing is it was said once, you know, there isn't anything that was created that can't be abused and destroyed and used against itself. And you know as well as I do that the enemy, the anti-spiritual forces, or ignorance, however you account for it, but there is always an anti-spiritual force around, I'm afraid.
Sure. Yeah, there will always be a Charles Manson of some kind, or something like that. You know, or a lot of people even vilify Tim Leary despite his intellect for halting progress of the psychedelic movement as opposed to progressing it. But
He was profligate. He was profligate with his optimism. You know what I mean by profligate?
Yeah,
He expended too much optimism, and his solution was far too simple. I think turn on, tune in, and drop out was the worst advice. One of the worst things that was ever said. You know, if you're turned on and tuned in, you're dropping in. What you
yeah,
want,
true.
what you want is the world to drop in with you. Now he said, no, you've got to leave. You've got to drop out of corporate systems, educational systems. And well, this is all very well if you're a well-heeled gentleman or gentlewoman who can afford to retire to your mansion while you explore the psychedelic universe. Very, very nice. But it's fatal advice for a young person who, say in Freemasonry, you cannot be a Freemason until you are independently free, i.e. you can support people, you're financially stable. That comes first. If you can't get
that's very wise.
If you can't get
Oh, well, I've just met many young people who seem to have difficulties with the material world, and they look to psychedelics and spiritual practices of trying to get out of it. But I know I forget which book it was, but I did read in one of Crowley's books, even he spoke to the importance of basically just getting your shit together before exploring, you know, the vestiges of consciousness, which is very important. You need a strong foundation.
Exactly right. Precisely right. And that was missing in the 60s. And many people came, as I talked to people who were there, to San Francisco, and they just were turning up from Midwestern towns because they were bored and they felt something was going on. And they heard Scott McKenzie sing, if you wear some flowers in your hair, and you know, you're just going to arrive in San Francisco and paradise is going to erupt. I know George Harrison went over with Derek Taylor in the end of 67, and he couldn't believe how depressing it was in San Francisco. He said, there's all these kids. He said they were like drunk. You know, the drugs were drinking, they were taking them as ways out. He said they weren't becoming spiritual and beautiful, which is what we all thought was going to happen. And he said it was like the Bowery, you know, it became very sad. And you got all these lost kids on the street, which gave ammunition for the enemies of the real movement to say, this is where all this hippie Beatle thing leads. It leads to kids on the street, homeless, doing drugs, becoming prostitutes and so forth. And that's true. And I do think some of the responsibility of that is with Timothy Leary's, what he said, not what he meant. I get what he meant, but unfortunately he said it in a simplistic manner, and it was heard by teenagers who haven't had the foundation. You can't take on the world unless you've actually taken on the world. You've got to, it is the world we're dealing with. It is a reality. It's no good denying it before you've even had a chance to get to grips with it, find out what it's like. The proper road to spirituality is to get into the world, work with it, and then discover that it's not the whole truth. And then through that knowledge, you're able to make a balance between your place in this world and those around you. And then you bring into that your spiritual adventure. And then you can transform this world from within. And that has always been the chosen path. I mean, if you're particularly chosen, I don't know, if you feel God's set you out to, say, a preaching ministry alone, fine. But even then, Jesus went into the wilderness and trained and learned to live with very little food and very little material comfort. And therefore, he was able to survive, for a time anyway, in the real world. So he'd gone through discipline. If you take the discipline out of it and you haven't become, this is what a master race is. A race of masters is people who've mastered themselves. It's not somebody who's born somewhere and I'm the master race. A master is somebody who's mastered themselves. Now that doesn't even make you in a position to master anybody else. If you can master yourself, that's a lifetime's achievement. You know, you ain't going to get perfection this side of paradise. But the effort is infinitely worthwhile. And the paragon, the byproduct of that is what is your art. That's what we do. We create things. We create and we recreate. And those are spiritual values. And you don't need to be a millionaire to do that. That's for sure. But you do need a firm basis. So I do think a certain practical education is as important in the first instance as a spiritual education. But the problem at the moment is we're not getting enough spiritual education, and our practical education is in many ways naive. I don't know what we're teaching our kids in school these days, but I'm not sure it's survival, sufficiently oriented towards the real conditions of life. It seems to be about getting a degree so you can avoid the real conditions of life. If you get the right job, you can be insulated from the real conditions. Well, it doesn't make you strong to be insulated from real conditions. It makes you vulnerable, and it also makes you reactionary. So I think part of true magical training, spiritual training, involves very much the dealing with this world. I talk about spirituality because I'm really talking to people who've made the effort to deal with the world, but have realized that there's a great deal more to it than that. Simply setting yourself up,
I think that's what appeals to me about magic as a spiritual path, and that's what kind of sets it apart from the more Eastern paths, is that it does reconcile with the material world and what one needs to face as, a material girl in a material world, but like it deals with the householder's dilemma of trying to realize spiritual consciousness, but still needing to deal with all the things that come with being a person in the world.
Yeah, well, what's the Hermetic axiom? As above, that which is above is like that which is below. Now, there is one is the symbol of the other. The visible world, or what Blake would call see through the vegetable eye, the material world is a symbol of the spiritual world, and vice versa. They work together. It's unus mundus. There's one world. When you see how they interact, then you can agree with the Hermetic statement that the world is the image of God. And that's the aim. That's what we're aiming at, is the image of God. That's why image making, which is your profession, is so important, because that's what we're all looking for, is the original image of God, which was reflected in man, which has become shattered and broken. And we're trying to put it back together. But to do that, you have to bring the two worlds together. They interpenetrate, and magic is about that. That's why they so-called hex alpha. They think it's that the Star of David is called, but it's about the interpenetration of spirit and matter, the two triangles intertwined, and that's our aim, is to introduce them to each other, as it were, and that's why man is the bridge. And artist, if I may quote Josephin Pelledin, artist, thou art the true priest. You have the secret, and it should be. You are looking for the perfect figuration of the spiritual idea. That's the aim, I think, of art. At its highest level, you're finding images for to figure the symbol. A symbol is a spiritual reality which has no end. A true symbol is not limited. Quote De Gaeta, a God defined is a finite God. We don't need to define this symbol. We don't have to say exactly what we're aiming at, because it's infinite.
Well, thank you. This has been a beautiful conversation, really inspiring. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom.
Well, I've inspired by it too, Jake. That's great.
I'm so glad I could inspire you. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for your time today.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
The Quarantine Sessions podcast with J. Cole.